Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast and part one of a two-part extravaganza on video game controllers.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the Region Free Gamers podcast. My name is Arnie and I'll be your host for this, probably one of our most interesting episodes so far, hopefully. We're going to be talking about best worst controllers. So before we get any further, let me introduce my two co-hosts for this episode. To the north of me, from Canada, from the White Horse region of Canada, Paul.
I don't know how you can forget Canada, dude. Like, it's gigantic. It's right
I know,
above you.
I was like, wait a second. But no, it is Canada. And then, so Paul, say hi.
Didn't I just say hi?
No, you berated me for 2 seconds.
Okay, fair enough.
Then,
Hello, my name's Paul. I like video games. Canada's the only country above the US. There are literally no other options.
No, and from the further north of me, from Finland, there is Masa.
Hey, yo.
All right. So, as we usually do, I think we're going to get started going through what we've been playing lately. And since I know Masa has something lined up already, I'm going to just throw it straight to him. So, Masa, what have you been playing recently?
I actually have 3 games here, and I'm going to start with the game that I've talked about it before, but I started playing again just recently. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which was actually one of my favorite games of 2017. And I finished the game last year, and it took me around 100 hours maybe. And then my total playtime now is like 165 hours. And that was only like in 2 weeks, like that extra 65. I usually never, like, especially if there's a very lengthy game, like all these RPGs, I pretty much never do New Game Plus. And also the other thing is that I never do is like post-game content, because I often feel like with my backlog, I'm like, yeah, I should just move on and start playing, something else. But then, because there's the upcoming story DLC for the game, I was like, yeah, maybe I should, play the game a little bit, but it's been a while, and at first I was like really lost, didn't even, remember the controls, but yeah, somehow I really got into it, and I actually, like, to be honest, there's been lots of updates and lots of like quality of life kind of updates. So I feel like the game is a lot better now than when it first launched. And the other thing is that I have finally understood the battle mechanics a bit better. And it's actually quite deep, and yeah, it's interesting also. And it's like the battle mechanics, like when you really get into it, like the tutorial in that game is ridiculously long, because there's 10 chapters, and like basically right before the final battle, you are still getting like tutorials.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this is like 100-hour game. So have you guys like ever heard of a game where, right before the final battle, you're still getting tutorials?
Never.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, so yeah, the learning curve
Especially
is
not
very
an
long.
RPG, like... Yeah. If I'm 100 hours in and I still don't know everything that I need to know, then this is a problem.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I've been doing a lot of side quests, and there's like, it's incredible like how much content there is in that game. I was actually talking to a friend of mine, and like he said that he did everything possible in that game, and like his playtime, like the game actually stopped counting it at like 999 hours.
Oh my god!
Yeah. So it's a grindy
I've actually always
game.
wondered if that happens.
But yeah, because there's the whole thing about, it takes a lot of time to collect the rare plates, because it's kind of like locked behind this gacha system.
Okay.
So
So it's like partly luck.
yeah. And yeah, absolutely, like all about the luck. But then after that, like if you want to max out all the plates, it takes, I don't know, yeah, I guess hundreds of hours.
Holy shit, man.
Yeah,
That's,
and doing my original playthrough, I mean, I have a bunch of rare plates, and I didn't even max any of them out during like those first 100 hours.
That's crazy, dude. What like in the recent updates, like what would you say is like the big difference, the big improvement with the updates?
They have improved the map, and that was like one of my main gripes about the game, like originally. Like the map is absolutely horrible. It's a lot better now. They have made the like there's a bit more like you can customize the game more now. Like when it comes to difficulty, they actually added easy mode, they added hard mode, and actually like New Game Plus was something that was also added. I haven't played New Game Plus, and most likely I won't. But that actually has like more of this quality of life improvements compared to the main game, and I believe that some like rare plates are a bit easier to get this time, like after these updates.
Yeah, so you're not spending 999 hours.
Yeah, no.
For them.
But yeah, like I was really into it again for a couple of weeks, but now like this week, I haven't played it anymore. But before I move on to the game that I have actually played this week, there's one game that I finished recently, and I've been wanting to talk about it. But like last time we did the E3 episode, and we skipped this segment completely. But yeah, there's this one indie game. I'm not sure how well known it actually is. But it's definitely not one of these indie darlings like, Shovel Knight or Hollow Knight. But yeah, I recently beat a game called Owlboy, which is a...
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Have you guys heard about it?
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah. So, the story behind the game is quite crazy. It's by a Norwegian studio called D-Pad Studio, and it actually took them 9 years to finish the game.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Isn't it like a side-scroller?
Yeah, it is, yeah. It's a 16-bit style, like retro platformer. And yeah, it has like really, really gorgeous pixel graphics. When it comes to all these like modern retro style games, I would say it's one of the best looking ones. Like I was constantly taking screenshots when I was playing on the Switch, and yeah, the game mechanics are really interesting. How you have the the main character, the Owlboy himself, and like he's flying around. Like the game is based like on that like flying mechanic. Sure, you can actually like walk on the ground and jump and do that kind of stuff. But for like let's say 90% of the time you're just flying. But yeah, the main character doesn't actually have like any real attacks, but yeah, you have these helper characters with like different skills, and then you have to switch between them depending on the situation, and all these dungeons, which are actually like quite lengthy, are often built based on a certain kind of gameplay mechanic.
Interesting.
Yeah, but yeah, it took me around maybe 12 hours to beat it. The soundtrack is also like really freaking good. I had some issues with it, and the worst one is that the game does crash quite a bit. So I played on the Switch. I'm not sure about the PC version or the PS4 version. But for me, the game crashed, I think 5 or 6 times during my playthrough.
Oh, wow.
And the worst crash happened after beating the final boss.
Oh, yeah, I remember you mentioning this.
Yeah. And then I actually read about it online, and someone said that they had to beat the final boss 6 times until he finally made it to the credits, because the game just kept crashing all the time. Oh, and man. Also, I had a very, very weird glitch, like, right before the final boss. There's a very annoying and a very tedious platforming section where they disable your flying skill, basically. And I died like 1,000,000 times, and then all of a sudden there was a weird glitch that let me skip a majority of that part.
Holy shit!
Yeah.
That's crazy, man.
Yeah, like, what happened was that, like I died, and then I rage quit to the Switch menu. Then I took a breather, I went back to the game, and the game had continued somehow, and then I was in a, different segment of that part, and I was like, wait, what the fuck happened? Like, I'm not supposed to be here.
Oh, man. That's
just happy little accident.
Yeah, but I gotta say, it's a bit fucked up that, these guys worked on the game for 9 years, and it still has these issues.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really good game, and I would definitely recommend it to everyone who's into retro style platformers.
Man, that's yeah, I mean, I guess they're probably gonna have some patches for it anyway.
Yeah,
so
they'll have to patch it
I mean,
out.
the crashing stuff I'm not really too worried about. It's very interesting that they decided at the end of the game to take away your flying and just be like, hey, here's a new game. Play this.
Yeah, it like to be honest, the game has, I believe, a few dungeons, and I thought that the dungeon design before the last dungeon is very good. They had some interesting gimmicks and interesting enemies and really good boss fights, but then the last dungeon where they completely changed the gameplay mechanics, I don't know, like honestly, like I didn't have a whole lot of fun playing that. But fortunately, the final boss, like that fight was maybe even the best one in the entire game.
Good.
Okay. And I mean, it seems like 12 hours for a 16-bit style platformer seems like a pretty substantial game.
Yeah, there's definitely some meat on those bones.
Yeah, and I mean it's quite a cheap game too. Like I think on the eShop it's around $20 or euros. A physical copy is a bit more expensive, maybe around like 30.
Yeah,
that's still not bad.
But yeah, at least I felt like there was enough content for the price.
Yeah, I mean, when you compare, like, and that's really kind of the core issue when you have a game like Kirby Star Allies, right?
Yeah,
is that if you're paying a, indie price for it, then it's great. Everybody's happy, right? You've got your 5 hours. It was fun. It was light. But it's a little bit more difficult when you're paying full price for that one.
Yeah,
and then
like
you have a game like Owlboy, and it's it leaves a much better taste in your mouth because it's slightly longer, but not too long, and it's just priced right.
Yeah, because like to be honest, I think Kirby Star Allies it's a good game, but if you think about the 3DS games, both of which are really good, but they were priced at like $40, and they are longer than Star Allies, which is a €60 game. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny. It's something that I never thought about until we did our E3 episode. Is the difference in price with the 3DS and Switch games. And so when you're getting, what is for all intents and purposes, a 3DS game on the Switch, I guess that's going to be an adjustment for everyone paying, a higher price for Let's Go Eevee, for essentially a game that looks like it could have been on the 3DS.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like a lot of these, like 3DS, like hit titles like Animal Crossing, Pokemon, Fire Emblem, a lot of fans have been used to like paying €40 for these games, and all of a sudden it's gonna be 60 to 70. So yeah, there's a big difference.
Well, I'm reasonably sure it'll be worth it. I mean, the Switch is like obviously a much superior platform to the 3DS, so at least we've got that going for it.
Yeah. But I still have one more game left. The game that I've been playing this week, Berserk and the Band of the Hawk on the PS4.
Oh yeah, buddy.
Yeah. Okay, so let me start off by saying that it's a very average Warriors game, but a hell of a Berserk game. Like especially like,
dude, that's all I want to know. That's all I want to hear. That's exactly what I want to hear. I don't even really care if it's that good. What I care about is if it's a good Berserk game.
Yeah, and if you think about like Musou games or Warriors games, a lot of time they don't really make sense. Like, I loved Fire Emblem Warriors, but like all these fights in the actual Fire Emblem games, they're like one-on-one fights. Like, none of these characters are, killing, like thousands of enemies. So it's like, I mean, it's cool, but the setting makes no sense. But in Berserk, like, I mean, how is it not a Musou game? I mean, it needs to be a Musou game. Although I have to say, it
makes perfect sense.
Yeah, like, although I have to say that, like, I'm not sure if you guys, well, Paul probably remembers the whole 100-man Slayer episode.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so they have that in this game, except that, like, I mean, I played through the mission and I actually killed like 1,500 people. And they were still talking about gods as a 100-man Slayer. But yeah, I gotta say, awesome. the production value in that game is surprisingly high. Cause yeah, the character models are really freaking good. Like, I don't think I've ever played a Musou game with like such high quality character models. And also, what's really great is that the game is fully voiced. Even like the side, there's like these little events, like, well, kind of like bonding events, but they are also fully voiced. And on top of that, the first half of the game features like there's the whole Golden Era arc, and it actually, like, all those, like, that part is featuring scenes straight from the anime movies. So that's really cool. Like, and nice. They cover all the, like, the most important scenes, and there's, I think, around 2 hours of like anime footage. But unfortunately, this second part of the game, like, once you make it past the Golden Era arc, yeah, like, they, like, I mean, there's the new anime series, and I kinda expected that they would have added scenes from, like, the Black Swordsman storyline, because the game actually came out a little bit after the first season of the anime had ended, but that's not the case. So for the second part of the game, you only have the CGI cutscenes, which are still cool, but it's not the same as, like, having those anime cutscenes.
No, it's not. Like, the anime cutscenes, you know, you got the double dose of obviously just watching cool cutscenes, which, you know, but the fact that it's from the anime and you've watched it before and it's familiar and you get a little bit of the nostalgia. Because, I mean, you and I, Masa, we've been Berserk fans for me, it's been like, I don't know, 20 years?
I first watched the original show like in the early 2000s, so yeah, I mean, it's been a while.
Yeah, man, long time.
Yeah.
So when you see the anime stuff come up, it's like, it's cool, man. It's that thing you saw a long time ago that you really loved, and yeah, no, I'm all on board with this. I'm really glad that you've played it and you told me it's good. I picked it up like 2-3 weeks ago.
Nice.
And yeah, it's just And
I think it's a really great way to like experience the story. I mean, it's not like the entire, you know, Berserk story, because I mean, it's still ongoing, but you will get to, you know, experience a huge chunk of it, and in a very, you know, cool way, because you get to actually like play it and you get to experience a lot of these great scenes. Of course, you have to remember that this is a Japanese game, so, and the Berserk anime and the manga, they contain some like really, really, well, brutal and questionable material. So, of course, there's blood, there's gore, but some scenes, like, I mean, of course, there's no nudity, because in Japan, automatically, the game features nudity. It's basically gonna be banned from being sold in stores. And there's that one legendary scene. I'm not gonna, you know, say what it is, but I'm sure that all the Berserk fans know what I'm talking about. But that, like, well, one really legendary and fucked up scene. It is in the game, but you don't really see anything. So yeah.
Yeah.
Which
yeah,
might
Arnie,
be a
let me
good
tell you,
thing,
man.
yeah.
If you're ever sitting down one day and you're like, you know, I really want to see an anime. You know, I hear people talking about them and blah 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 blah, and you know, it's been a long time since Dragon Ball. Dude, if you have to pick one anime, you pick Berserk. Absolutely. And I don't even think there's any question here. Am I right, Masa?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's weird because I really like anime, and I've seen like most of the classics, except for Berserk. I think Berserk is like the one standout of like anime that everybody's been telling me, like, I've seen it, it's great, you know, like, it's fondly remembered, like, all these years later. And so it makes me happy to see that after 20 years, you finally get the Berserk game you've always wanted.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
because the Dreamcast Berserk game was like, it was average, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure the PS4 one is a much better experience related to the game.
Yeah, much better distillation of the series, at least.
Well said.
And then there was the PS2 game, which we never got in the West. I have heard good things about that game, but yeah, unfortunately, we never got it. So yeah, and
is that one? What kind of game is that? Is that also a Muso game? Or is that
it's not a Muso game. But it's a hack and slash game.
Okay.
What's cool about it is that it actually contains like an original side story, written by the series creator. So that's cool,
that's
and
cool.
and then it does also cover some parts of the manga.
Interesting.
Right on.
All right. So, Paul, why don't you tell me what you've been playing?
Well, like Masa, like a bunch of different things. I'll just tell a few stories to kind of get the experiences out of the way.
All right.
Last time I mentioned Metal Gear Solid 2, I finished it a couple days ago, and I had some friends over last night for dinner, and one of my buddies, he came downstairs and we were talking about video games, and I told him, I said, I finished Metal Gear Solid 2, and I'm like, really good game, but I fell asleep during the end. and I looked at his face and I'm like, oh boy. And he waited for me to stop talking because he's a good friend. And he's like, dude, I not only fell asleep during the end when I played that game, I fell asleep during the end, and I had a friend over to watch me play the game because he was so excited for Metal Gear Solid 2. And it was between because there's basically like two kind of main bosses at the end of the game, and there's this really long philosophical exposition between the two final bosses, and I felt myself nodding off, and I'm like, no, you can't. This sounds like the end of the game. I can't nod off, but holy shit, man, did I just ever not care about what they were talking about? And eventually I'm like, all right, I'm just going to shut my eyes. And when I hear the game over music or the game, right in,
Yeah.
then I'll continue playing. And that's what happened. Like,
Okay.
I fell asleep and then I heard them scream out Raiden's name. I woke up and then I finished the game and watched the actual ending afterwards. So,
well, it's that
So
one.
at least you didn't miss the ending.
yeah,
I was
exactly.
gonna say I was
like,
worried that you would just get killed and have to do the whole thing over again.
oh my god. Yeah, it was a little bit ridiculous. I've been playing a lot of Street Fighter 30th Anniversary, the collection for the PS4. I even picked up a new fight stick for it. I've had the same fight stick for many, many years with adapters for every new system that I get that I want to use it on. But for the 30th anniversary, I was hyped, man. I was talking with a lot of people on Instagram and stuff, and everybody was like really excited for it. And I'm like, you know what, fuck it. I'm getting a new fight stick. I think it's time. I worked some overtime at work. I'm gonna get a little treat. And the fight stick's awesome. However, my skills at Street Fighter are not. Man, oh man, it's the first time I've really like sat down and played Street Fighter, quote unquote, seriously in a long time. Holy fuck, man. I don't know if it's because I'm an old man, but I am fucking terrible at it.
But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have been saying the same thing, like, because the collection, it features the arcade. They are arcade ports, right? And not like the home console versions. And a lot of people have been saying that, yeah, this is a lot more difficult than I remembered, but I believe that the arcade versions are, or were more difficult than the home console ports.
Yeah. The computer AI, like when you're playing against the computer, because you get a trophy every time you finish one of the games. And I don't really care about trophies, but I kind of do. Yeah. And so I'm trying to beat the computer, and I'm having a way easier time beating actual real people who, are supposed to be better. Like, the computer used to be a joke back in the day. It was just kind of a way to practice your combos and stuff like that, because we didn't have training modes then. Yeah. But now I'm playing against the computer, and I'm like, what the fuck? Why is Zangief such a monster? Like, what is this?
Well, good to know, because I get my ass kicked by like the Super Nintendo AI on a regular basis. So,
by the way, have you played the game online?
Yeah, I've played it online.
And how does it work? Like, how's the netcode?
Good. I've had no issues.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know.
And I mean, you and I, we live in relatively remote areas, so you know, sometimes I have problems that other people do not. But no, I haven't really had any issues. Have you heard anything?
No, but I guess more about like you mentioned, remote areas. Like for example, I'm not sure what the servers are like, but I believe that they're probably like European players will get matched with other Europeans, and sometimes it's probably like really difficult to find lobbies with players.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So there's been a lot of there's been some Street Fighter Collection, which has been humbling, but also fun because like now that I've been playing, you know, anywhere between 10 to 40 minutes each day, I've been playing a little bit, and I can actually feel myself getting better at it. You know, the combos that I was only completing 2 out of 10 times, now I'm completing 5 out of 10 times, and that's kind of fun. It reminds me of the old days when, you know, you just start getting better at it, and better at it, and better at it. And, you know, there's that feedback loop where you feel good because you pull something off. And, you know, the super combos are still out of my grasp. Again, you know, like it used to be that I could do these things. They're never easy. They were never easy. Only like, you know, top level players find them easy, and I was never one of those, but I was good enough to do super combos. But now, I don't know, man. Maybe I'm just slow. Maybe I'm just old and slow.
Does it feel better with the new stick?
The new stick, frankly, didn't really move the needle. I could have just used my old one and been just as happy. My old one's an X-Arcade stick, and from what I read online, like the thing about the X-Arcade stick is that it's nice and heavy, and it feels good. I've had no issues with the buttons or the joystick. But like you go online and you read a lot, and it's a lot of people who are, I don't know, they're either semi-professional players or they're really good at pretending to be semi-professional players. And they're talking about all the different parts, and you have to have Sanwa parts, and you have to have these particular buttons and so on. And I was like, all right, well, like I said again, I'll treat myself, right? So I got a stick that has all Sanwa parts and was well reviewed. Kind of a mid-tier stick, like not one of the super... It's the Quanba Obsidian, for those who care about that kind of thing. So it's kind of mid-tier, not entry-level, but not super high-end. Yeah. Frankly, I don't really notice that much of a difference in performance. And frankly, I think it's because I'm not good enough to notice a big difference in performance. Gotcha. I think I could have just used my old stick and been fine. But with that said, new stick is cool. It's new, so I have no real regrets about picking it up. It looks really good, and that counts for something.
Yeah, and I mean sometimes, you know, at least in my experience, I've had this with controllers, never fight sticks because I haven't owned that many. But sometimes when you just use it for a longer period of time, you sort of start breaking it in a little bit, and it gets a little more comfortable.
Yeah, and I'm reasonably sure that that'll happen with this one. This one's a little bit like the joystick itself's a little bit different than the X-Arcade stick. So you know, I guess I'll get used to that as time goes on. So a couple more quick hits. Also because of the fight stick, I've been pulling all my old fighting games out, and I was playing KOF 14 a couple days ago, and man, so every once in a while my wife comes downstairs, right? I'm in the game cave, and she'll come downstairs and she'll sit down just because like she's bored or something, and she'll watch me play a game and we'll chat as I play. Mm-hmm. And so I pop in KOF and I load up story mode, and I select the Japan team because, you know, Kyoku Tsunagi, and my wife is sitting there and I'm like, what are the odds that I'm going to get paired up against Mai Shiranui first? And KOF has like, you know, it has like 40 characters, right? Something silly. Yeah. I'm like, no, I'm comfortable with these odds. I think that won't happen. Obviously, first match is against the girls' team, and the very first character that I play against is Mai Shiranui. And so Mai Shiranui's doing her bending over and swaying thing. Okay. And my wife looks at me and she's like, really? You're playing this game? And I was like, yeah.
In all its glorious HD graphics.
But yeah, Paul, I don't think you will be playing Senran Kakura anytime soon.
Oh God, no. If I did, it would be, while she's away. But no, I don't own any Senran Kagura games. Pardon?
Alone in a locked room.
Yeah, pretty much. The same thing happened a few weeks ago. Like, I don't know what it is about this woman and her timing with walking in while I'm playing video games, but I was playing Metal Gear Solid 2 a few weeks ago, and so my wife sits down, and because it's Metal Gear Solid, it's a little bit more interesting than most games for the spectator, because there's a lot of exposition, there's a lot of, cutscenes with talking and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm talking to Rose on the codec, and the first thing Rose says, she goes, "Jack, are you only with me because I'm beautiful?" and my wife looks at me and she's like, "Really? You're playing this game?" And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, the dialogue's usually much better. And to be fair, Jack did call her out for being vain, which was a nice thing. And then the very same night, I'm upstairs and I'm playing Trails of Cold Steel on the Vita. And usually when I play the Vita in bed, I'm wearing headphones, right? Because my wife will be reading her book or something like that. She doesn't care if the volume's on the Vita, but I think it's polite anyway to wear headphones most of the time. This one particular night, I forgot to bring the headphones up. I'm already lying in bed. I'm like, I turn to her and I'm like, "Are you okay with the volume?" She's like, "Yeah, I don't care." Okay, great. And I'm playing Trails of Cold Steel, and Emma is climbing up a ladder. And
I know exactly what you're talking about.
I'm saying, right? Emma's climbing up the ladder, and she's like, "Wow, this ladder is difficult to climb." And then Fia's like, "Yeah, it's because your boobs." And then my wife turns to me and she's like, "Really? You're playing this game?" And I'm like, yeah, I am.
But yeah, I gotta say, I'm really happy that my girlfriend is like really cool with all the fan service games. But when I was playing Galgun,
Galgun.
Oh God.
Yeah, on the PS4, yeah, that's when I got the whole, "Really, Masa? Are you really playing this?"
Oh, Galgun.
Yeah, I played it once and it's been shelved ever since.
Yeah,
and I have to be honest, like
so.
I'm like, I don't feel ashamed about like owning like every fucking Senran Kakura game ever, and I mean I'm a fan, but like Galgun, I gotta admit that I'm a bit ashamed about owning that game.
Yeah, that's
too much even for me.
Yeah, there is a level of difference between Senran Kagura and Galgun. Galgun is what it is. We don't need to go into it.
Yeah.
I've been playing Danganronpa, Trigger Happy Havoc, but I think I'm going to save that for the next episode. Because that's a really interesting one. I wouldn't mind going into a little more detail on. So yeah, Arnie, man, tell me what you've been playing.
So mine's going to be really quick as usual, but I did want to say that I've heard so many good things about Danganronpa that I might have to go out and find it.
Yeah, I think you should. I think it's worthwhile. It's unlike anything I've played before.
Yeah, it's a very unique game.
But I'll go into more detail next time.
Yeah. So for me, it was pretty much, since the last time we recorded, I just beat 2 games. I beat Parasite Eve, which I wish that Ozzy was on here to get his take on it.
I know, right?
I really enjoyed the game. I will say that I think the final boss is kind of bullshit. Not necessarily in the actual fight. He has like 4 different forms, but it's never really that hard to beat him. But after you kill his final form, you get a long cutscene, and then all of a sudden it brings you back to gameplay. And I was very confused because I thought I had beat the game. And what you have to do is you have to run you're on this like tanker, and so you have to run back in the tanker, and you have to run this like very specific route to get to the engine room to blow up the ship with the final boss on it. And he's chasing you throughout this entire thing, and if he catches you, it's instant death.
Damn.
And if you die, you have to go back to the beginning of the final boss fight, which is preceded by an unskippable cutscene that lasts probably like 3 to 4 minutes.
Oh.
So I will tell you that as soon as I saw that, I immediately Googled the route to go, because I just was not about to do all that again.
Yeah.
But aside from that, it was a very good game. I really enjoyed playing it. I'm really looking forward to playing the sequel because I've heard that it's different. It still has like the same combat mechanics, but story-wise and sort of presentation-wise, it's different from the first. But you know, for a 10-ish hour RPG, it was very entertaining. It's probably, I want to say it's one of the shortest RPGs I've ever played, and I didn't think that I would have enough time to sort of get into the story and the characters and all that, but it's kind of the perfect length for what it is.
It doesn't have to be 40 hours to have a good story. Like, you know, it doesn't... Dude, a movie is 2 hours on average, right?
Exactly. So it was, I mean, you know, it did what it needed to do. It came, it saw, it conquered, and then I finished it. And I do have the option of going back. I might go back just to fiddle around with the New Game Plus content, but I'm not sure. And then I finished Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright. Another game that I really enjoyed, but dragged towards the end a lot.
Oh.
How long is that game?
I beat it, I want to say, maybe 35 hours is what it took me. Yeah.
That's really long for a puzzle game.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing is that there's actually less puzzles in this one that there are in other Professor Layton games, but the Phoenix Wright parts are the parts that really sort of extend the gameplay, because it's sort of... Have either of you played a Phoenix Wright game before?
I actually haven't.
I have played one of them a little bit.
Yeah, so basically what it is, and I think this one introduces new stuff, but what it basically boils down to is you hear testimony from a witness, and then you have to question the witness, and it sort of breaks down each part of their testimony, and you can follow up on each part and hear more dialogue, and then you have to find inconsistencies and sort of call them out on it. And you get evidence, and you can sort of present that evidence, but you have to, with the evidence, you have to present it at the right time, because the way it works is you have like 5 strikes, and if you get something wrong enough times, you lose the whole trial and you have to start over again from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so the final trial, I want to say, and I don't want to exaggerate, but I want to say it took me like 3 hours to do the whole thing.
That's insane.
It sort of has like surprise witnesses, and then like you think you're at the end, and then it keeps going, and then you think you're at the end again, and then it keeps going, and then you stop to do puzzles, and then you come back, and so it's like this whole rigmarole. But you know, it was fun. Professor Layton games usually have very interesting stories because I think they're sort of set up like they're usually, at least all the ones I've played, are usually set up like murder mysteries, and so you're sort of weaving, sort of undoing the tangled web of like all this stuff that's going on to find out the sort of the mystery at the end, the twist, because every one of the games sort of starts with like this thing that's either magic or like impossible or, you know, has this sort of fantastical nature to it. And Professor Layton sort of breaks it down to like, this is how it's actually done. And it always turns out that it's, you know, something completely plausible and explainable that just tends to look like, you know, magic or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's very enjoyable to sort of try to figure things out on your own and then see them play out in the story. And for the most part, it's not predictable. There's only been a couple things that I was like, I totally knew that was going to happen. So I don't know. It's enjoyable, but it definitely towards the end just drags way too much. So I would recommend it if you're a fan. But I honestly, I think I enjoyed just the plain Professor Layton games more than this combination.
Yeah, every once in a while they'll try something new, and it doesn't quite work out the way they hope, right?
Yep. And then I put this on Instagram, but I finally picked up Yakuza 0.
Yeah,
hell yeah!
To start playing it yesterday, and I didn't have a chance, so that'll probably be the first thing I do after we finish recording this episode. So I think that we're ready to sort of dive into the meat and potatoes of this episode.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty excited, especially doing the research for this episode. I think there's some good stuff to be discussed here. So basically what we're going to talk about today is controllers, video game controllers. So our best favorite controllers and our worst least favorite controllers. I think just starting off, I want to set up some ground rules for the people at home. We're limiting it to home consoles, obviously, because we don't have 100+ hours to talk about this. So no mouse keyboard, no arcade control schemes, even though some of those are really cool and I think would be fun to talk about in a different episode. We're also not talking about anything earlier than 2600. We recognize that there are, like, the Odyssey, Channel F, all that old stuff that's really cool, but we just don't have time, and we haven't. I at least have not had a chance to play any of those systems.
Yeah, me neither.
And then the big thing is controller variants. I think we're going to mention some, but I don't think that we're considering them for the most part. I think we're mostly focusing on first-party sort of default controllers that you would have gotten with your console. So no DK bongos, no fishing rods, no racing wheels, no Hori controllers, no arcade sticks for the most part. And I think that's fair, because I think that the people who created these game systems were not intending you to necessarily play with these sorts of inputs. So I think it'd be unfair to sort of consider, something like the Hori controllers for how awesome they are. I think that it's much more true to the intent of the list if we sort of consider the default controllers for each system. Does that sound right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and if we go into all the variants, again, we don't have 100 hours, right? Like, I'd love to do an episode one day where we go into all the weird controllers, like the Namco Ridge Racer 4 controller for the PS,
yeah.
Like stuff like that, right?
Yeah, like the one you turn, like the wheel.
Yeah, because that was an interesting little thing, but not for today, man. Yeah, let's go over the stock ones.
But yeah, a lot of these I haven't, like, when it comes to, like, these crazy variants I haven't used. The DK Bongos I have, but unfortunately that night I was so drunk that I don't remember what it was like. So I'm fine with us skipping that stuff.
Basically, all I've heard is that the DK Bongos, along with the Guitar Hero controller, are probably the most interesting ways to play Dark Souls.
I had never heard of that.
But aside from that, yeah, I think I'm pretty sure there's a guy who finished Dark Souls using the Guitar Hero controller.
Of course there is. Oh my god.
Yeah,
I'm
of course
both
there
like
is.
I'm amused and completely unsurprised. That's awesome.
And then the final one, which I hadn't really thought about until I started doing research, is handhelds. So handhelds sort of have their own controller schemes, to say, but obviously we're not going to talk about those.
Nah.
I think that merits its own episode, separate from that. But aside from that, I think we're pretty good. We're just going to go down a list of controllers, briefly talking about, their sort of form factor, functionality, maybe our experiences with them. And then towards the end, we'll have a discussion and see if we can come to a modestly civil agreement over best and worst controllers.
Yeah, it's gonna be console wars all over again.
Exactly. So the first thing I wanted to start off with before we did anything else, I wanted to talk about the first controllers you guys remember using, just to get a baseline of what the console experience was for you guys starting out. So, Paul, what was your first controller, if you remember?
Well, I think my first controller probably would have been like a combination of the NES and the Sega Master System. I had friends who had, Atari 2600s. I had a friend who had an Intellivision. And we'll talk about that controller momentarily. But the first time I used one, I think I was at the department store, and they had a kiosk with Super Mario Brothers, and I used that Nintendo controller, and boy oh boy was I ever fascinated. So fascinated, in fact, that I went out and got a Sega Master System instead. So after that, it was the Sega Master System controller. Which did have one cool little thing that I've never seen since, which is that on the D-pad, there was a little... You could install like a really tiny joystick and screw it in to the D-pad. It was completely optional. I actually did that.
Some of that later.
What's that?
We'll be getting into some of the controllers that also use that later.
Yeah, you asked me a very simple question, and I'm getting very long with it. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
But yeah, those were basically the first two.
Okay. And had you been to arcades before then?
Yes.
Okay.
But so I was too young to appreciate different controls. Like, gotcha. I remember, I think the first game I ever played was Centipede. And that's the one with the trackball. So you're moving around the Centipede with the trackball. And, I was so young that I don't remember if I actually played it or if the demo was running and I thought I was playing even though it was the demo running.
Gotcha. I've definitely done that before.
Yeah.
So that is completely feasible. So what about you, Masa? What was the first controller you ever used?
Yeah, my first was also the NES controller. But around the same time, this was, I think, in 1990. But around the same time, like Atari, like 2600. For example, I'm not even sure if it was ever released in Finland. But we did have Amiga 500, Commodore 64, which had a very similar joystick. So yeah, like those were my first ones, like the NES, and then like the joystick. Okay.
And had you been to arcades before doing like home console stuff?
Do you really want me to cry about my very tragic childhood in Soviet Finland in this arcade-less hellhole in the early 90s? So yeah, the answer is no.
Okay, I thought maybe you got like an arcade version of Tetris or something like that.
Nope, not even that.
Okay. All right, so for me at least, it was the Super Nintendo controller was the first one I remember using to play games at home. I got a Super Nintendo, and that was even late because I was born in 91. I didn't get a Super Nintendo till 96. So I was using Super Nintendo controllers when the Nintendo 64 was out.
Yeah.
But the Super Nintendo was the first one for me. I don't remember ever playing anything earlier than that. In fact, the first time I played on an NES, I played Duck Hunt. So I used a zapper before I even used a regular NES controller.
Oh, yeah. That was actually one of my first too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then as far as arcades, I do not recall going to arcades prior to the age of maybe like 7 or 8. So the Super Nintendo was all I had for a very long time. Actually, complete aside, but much like the NES, the zapper being the first thing I ever used, I never had a Genesis, but I did have a Nomad. So before I ever used a Genesis controller, I used a Nomad.
And I
must be the first person in the world.
That Nomad.
So that was my introduction to that.
Cool.
And so just a general question I wanted to get out there, which is something that I've sort of been considering myself now, is do controllers matter in the sense of your level of dislike or like of a console? Like, has a controller ever made you enjoy a console more or dislike a console more than you otherwise would have? Let's start with Masa this time.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think maybe, for example, well, I guess we will get to it later, but for example, yeah, N64 nowadays, of course, back in the day, I mean, somehow, I mean, I did like it a lot back in the day, but nowadays, it doesn't feel right, especially after getting used to these like modern controllers, and that's why the whole prospect of maybe Nintendo releasing an N64 mini classic, like, to be honest, it wouldn't be authentic without the, you know, the OG controller, but I do want like an alternative version of that. Because it's like some time ago I played Perfect Dark for the first time in many years, one of my favorite games, and the controller, it just doesn't feel very comfortable.
Gotcha. What about you, Paul?
I wouldn't say that a controller design was ever the make or break point for deciding whether to purchase a console or not.
Yeah.
But I will say that I really hated the original PlayStation controller. Especially because at the time I was really into fighting games, and that D-pad is like murder on your thumb if you want to do fireballs and uppercuts consistently. So the fact that the PlayStation compared to the Saturn was already kind of inferior for 2D games was a strike against it for me anyway. I know not for most, but that controller too, I was like, man, this thing is brutal. I did not like that original PlayStation controller, but later iterations like the DualShock and so on was definitely an improvement. Whereas with the Saturn, you know, very similar actually. That first generation Saturn controller, I do not like. I still don't like it. But the second generation Saturn controller, the more kind of sleek looking one that looks like the Genesis 6 button, that one, you know, that was a big factor for me anyway, enjoying the system. So never something that would make me not buy or buy a system, but definitely controllers have impacted my enjoyment.
Yeah. And I mean, I think part of the reason, what I was trying to get at with this question is more so, you know, it's easy to say, like, when a console's already bad, like, oh, and the controller sucks. Or when a console's already good, oh, and the controller's awesome. But I was more so interested in, like, has a good console having a bad controller affected your enjoyment of a console that you know is good, or has a bad console that has a good controller been like, I wish this controller was on another console? You know what I mean? And so for me, it's definitely been the case where, you know, I've been playing games and I'm like, I really enjoy this game, but this does not feel comfortable in my hands. I don't like playing this game on this controller. And I think the N64 is probably the king of that feeling. Like a lot of N64 games, I'm like, this game is good and I like it, but I wish I could play it with a different controller.
I do have to mention, like, now that you brought that up, the Wii U gamepad. That's another one. Like, I think, well, okay, the Wii U wasn't exactly like the greatest console, but it does have many, like, truly great games. But yeah, the gamepad, I mean, it's one of the biggest reasons why the console failed. And it's not comfortable, it's big, it's clunky, it's heavy. And there's a lot of games where you are basically forced to, you know, play the game, like, staring at the gamepad screen. And the resolution is really bad. Or, well, not horrible, but yeah, it's not HD, so yeah, a lot of those, like, I'm actually happy about all these, like, sweet spots of the Wii U games, because no need to use the gamepad anymore.
All right, so now that we've sort of set the groundwork of what we're working with, let's just go through some controllers. So the first set of controllers I got here are, you know, just early video game controllers. Starting with the Atari 2600, released in 1977. The Atari 2600 for me, and I've only used it very few times. I don't have extensive experience with the 2600 controller, Already cannot make my list. Not lefty friendly. I'm lefty. So playing Atari 2600 games is such a chore for me. Aside from that, I do think it's a very it's a very good starting point for where controllers would go from here. It's sort of the a good shape and size for, I think, children to use it and also adults to use it. And I think that comes from the fact that back then they weren't exclusively marketing to kids. And it's also, you can't get much more simple than a joystick and a button, right?
No, you can't.
So Go ahead, Paul.
No, I was gonna say, like, if Apple was designing a joystick today, might look like that.
Exactly. It doesn't suffer from overcomplicating anything. So I think it's a really good controller. But because of my, lefty deficiencies, I can't enjoy it like most people. I know you said you had some experience with this controller, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, there's really not much to go over. Like, I'm right-handed, so I had no issues with it. Basically it's meant to sort of mimic the arcade stick, right? Because at the time, home consoles were still, I don't know, I don't want to call them a novelty. It was big business before the crash in the 80s. But, at the time, it was kind of like arcade and home port, right? So you have your Pac-Man in the arcade, and then you have your home port, and so on. And so, I mean, this joystick ostensibly is to mimic, the feel of an arcade stick, which it does quite well. I enjoyed it. I mean, obviously the NES controller comes out and kind of makes it obsolete because you need more buttons for more complex games. But for the games of the time, this joystick was, perfectly cromulent.
Oh yeah, I have a question for you guys.
Sure.
Do you think that games are getting more complex because of the controllers, or are the controllers getting more buttons and becoming more complex because of the games? Because if you think about like Atari 2600, you had a joystick and one button, and a lot of these games, like, all you need to do is like move around and maybe jump or shoot, and that's it.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think that it might be a little bit of both, depending on who the console maker is and the time frame. I think that a lot of times, especially if you're if you're a studio that comes out, that sort of starts making games after a console's already come out, you sort of have to adapt to them. But if a new console's coming out, a lot of these developers, they get dev kits, they get prototype stuff, they get to sort of see what, a console and a controller is going to look like before it comes out. So they sort of get to tailor their experience to the controls that are, available to them.
I would say it's probably 80-20. The controller influencing design compared to software design influencing the controller. Historically, I know we're not talking about portables, but you have the Nintendo DS, which just brings a whole new paradigm to game design. Adding extra buttons. Plus, I think we've reached the saturation point with buttons. But the PlayStation 3, the 6-axis, that was the big thing at the time, and so there were games designed specifically to take advantage of the 6-axis. They weren't very good, so they stopped doing that.
Yep.
But
yeah, I'd say it's mostly controllers influencing design rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I think, we have reached the point where we don't really need more buttons. Like, for example, in DualShock 4, you have the touchpad, and I feel like most PS4 games, I have played maybe around 50 PS4 games, and a lot of them either reduce it to a a normal, an extra button, you just press it and things happen, and it's usually open up a menu or something. But honestly, most games don't even use that in any meaningless way or meaningful way.
It just I couldn't agree more, Masa. To me, that touchpad is just it's basically a button.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I tend to agree with Paul that it's probably sort of an 80-20 split. I don't think a lot of console manufacturers are going to sort of change the way they've chosen to design a controller to fit with, a certain game genre or gameplay expectations. I think for them, it's probably more about feel and comfort and stuff like that. Because, they expect you to really play these games and really put some time into the system. So they have to design a controller that's comfortable to use and comfortable to hold. But moving on from that and talking about something that's probably not very comfortable to hold, the Atari 5200 controller. 1982, so moving a little bit further ahead, I don't think that there has ever been, and I could be wrong, but I don't think there's ever been such a big departure from one console to the next in terms of what a controller looks like.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
So for the viewers listening, the Atari 5200 controller, at least the basic model that comes with the system, is basically a remote control shaped device with a joystick on top, or sort of on the upper portion of the controller, a 12 number pad on the bottom, 3 buttons on top of the joystick, and 2 shoulder buttons on either side of the controller.
Good lord. I'll be honest with you, I didn't even notice the shoulder buttons.
Yeah. Shoulder buttons are key. Shoulder buttons are usually I think the shoulder buttons are mainly the replacements for the Atari 2600 button, so I think those are your main action buttons for a lot of games.
Yeah.
I don't know if 5200 games had overlays. I think they did, but I'm not entirely sure. So overlay is something you would slide on top of that number pad to tell you what each button does for a certain game.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are some improvements with the 5200. Lefty friendly, because you have shoulder pads on either side. Pause button, which is always nice. And some drawbacks, specifically the original version of the controller. I believe the joystick is analog instead of just a regular joystick, but it's apparently terrible. It's unresponsive. It breaks extremely easily.
Oh, boy.
And especially for Atari games, I can't see the advantage of having an analog controller over just the regular joystick controller you had with the 2600. So it seems overly complicated.
Yeah. It's amazing when you look at it, and you think of the types of games that it was meant to be used for. It's baffling.
But yeah, isn't it really crazy how Atari has the joystick with the least buttons? There's the first one with only one button, and then they also have the controller, even compared to modern ones, with the most buttons ever. And these were back to back.
This is, let's see, if we're talking 12 buttons on the number pad, 3 on top, so that's 17 buttons if you count the shoulder buttons on this controller.
That's insane.
What would I ever need 17 buttons for? Honestly, if I didn't know what it was, I don't know. If you took that joystick off of there, I would say it's a phone.
Yeah,
it looks like
a
cell phone. And we can see there was obviously improvements made. I know there are third-party sticks that are much better for 5200 games. I think the big thing with the 5200 was that it was just sort of trying to emulate some of the other consoles that were around at this time that we'll get to in a minute. But you can see that Atari sort of reverse coursed immediately, because in 1986 they released the 7800, and the 7800 controller is essentially the Atari 2600 controller, but being able to be used by left-handed people. It's a joystick and 2 shoulder buttons, and that's the whole thing.
Yep.
So they sort of realized that, this was not the way to go. And I think part of that decision was the Atari 7800 also plays 2600 games. So you needed to have, a controller that could sort of do that. And I think I have never used a 7800 controller. To my eye, it looks more comfortable than a 2600 controller would be, just because the shoulder buttons just let you lay the controller flat on your hand and then use the joystick with your other hand.
I don't see how that works, to be honest with you.
Really?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time visualizing how my hand would. I'm sure once I actually held it, my opinion would change. But just looking at it, I'm like, how on earth do I hold this thing and hit these shoulder buttons?
So the way I'm seeing it is you sort of lay it flat on your non-dominant hand, and then you use your thumb or your index finger to hit shoulder buttons on either side, and then use your dominant hand to use the joystick on it.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying now. That's
the way.
That's awkward.
Yeah, that's the way. It's sort of the 5200. I think that's the way you held that controller also, is like flat on your hand and then use your other hand to do the joystick and the buttons.
But what about the other 12 buttons?
Listen, they can't all be winners, Paul. We gotta figure out how you're gonna hit all these buttons. But I will say that of the three, I don't know. I think I'm partial to the 7800 controller, just in terms of look and in terms of sort of form factor. It seems like a lot less cumbersome than the 5200. And the 2600 controller, I mean, will always be a classic, right? Like, for a lot of people, it's their first video game controller, so it's going to be hard for people to say, that this other sort of Atari controller is better. But I think form factor wise, at least for me, it looks cooler. It's got that nice, like, shiny Atari logo on it. I definitely recommend that everybody start Googling pictures of all these controllers.
I have to be honest. When I see the 7800 controller, I see something that I would use to, like, stop my door from closing. It just looks like a big wedge. Yeah.
Like to fill a inflatable mattress or something?
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are sort of the Atari controllers, except for one notable exception, which we will get back to later on. And so coming back to sort of the things that were happening while Atari was going on. Atari did have some competitors during this time, most notably throughout the existence of the late existence of the 2600 and early existence of the 5200, the Intellivision and the ColecoVision. I sort of lumped these two together because, with the exception of the joystick mechanisms, they're almost identical to me.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree.
And speaking of looking like phones, these two.
I know, right?
Exactly.
Even the cable is like a phone cable.
Yeah. It's a very and these two, I believe, and maybe you would know, Paul, if you ever used one of them, but I think the controllers were attached to the console, so you could sort of put them in. They sort of nested inside the console, and you pulled them out when you wanted to play.
Not having owned either of these, I can't quite remember that. I did have friends who owned. I had one friend who had an Intellivision, one friend who had a ColecoVision. What I can tell you from experience is that I really liked the Intellivision controller. Like,
really?
Obviously it looks bizarre, right? It looks like a phone, right? It's kind of strange, but you hold it. You have your right hand on the top to hit the buttons, and you have your left hand on the bottom to use the joystick, like the pad. The pad was fine. The buttons were, okay. It wasn't a bad controller. The ColecoVision one, on the other hand, was a little bit. It just wasn't as good. Like, they look very similar, but the sticks are a bit different. The Intellivision was the way to go.
Okay. And it's interesting. I've never used an Intellivision controller. I have used a ColecoVision controller. I didn't find it terrible, but definitely not super good to play with.
Yeah.
Just for context, they both are rectangular blobs that have number pads and sort of joysticks. I guess the Intellivision has more of a joy disc because it's sort of sunken into the controller. It's just a disc that I think spins, and then you hit whatever direction you want to go on it. The ColecoVision one is sort of protruding from the top of the controller.
Yeah.
And like the 5200, they have shoulder buttons on either side. The ColecoVision and Intellivision, I know both did have overlays for every single game that came with for the consoles. So you'd basically slip the overlay on top of the number pad, and it would tell you what each button did. And that's sort of how you play.
Yeah, and the Intellivision, it had, I don't want to call it Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if it used that license or not, but the earliest role-playing game I ever played was on the Intellivision, and, and that overlay had something for like every button.
Yeah.
So, I mean, props to them for actually using the 12 buttons. Yeah,
absolutely. I remember seeing some gameplay of that and hearing about that sometime before. But I mean, I'm sure for the people playing these games, this must have seemed like the future. You know what I mean? Like going from a one-button controller to something with 14, 15, 16, 17 buttons, and seeing games that sort of did things with all these buttons. I mean, if I was growing up in that time, just having played an Atari 2600, and I saw these consoles, like, not having played them, I would have thought that this was, the wave of the future, and this is what controllers were going to look like forever.
Alas, they did not.
Fortunately.
That's right. Well, I mean, everything sort of changes with the times, and I think, the biggest, and we're going to talk about this in a second, but, when you go back, the thing that I think really blew everything up was the D-pad. Once you get the D-pad, movement doesn't become so cumbersome, I think, especially in like 2D space. Because I know a lot of Intellivision games, the overlays used some of the number pad buttons to move. And I don't know if that was just a way to like fill in some of the buttons, or if it was just easier for some people to sort of control movement with just like north, south, east, west sort of cardinal directions. But the D-pad solved a lot of those problems. The only other console that I thought was worth talking about from this time frame was the Vectrex.
Yeah, the Vectrex is always worth talking about.
Yes, and the Vectrex is very interesting, both as a console and a controller. Just vector graphics all day, every day. So black and white, sort of. I don't even know how to describe, like sort of skeletal, like wireframe graphics for everything.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description.
But super cool looking,
man.
Like even to the modern sensibilities, like I have, seeing Vectrex games play is like crazy.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's got that like retro future feel to it, more so than any other like old console. I played it for the first time, and you were there, Arnie. It's when we were in Brooklyn at that retro game fest, and that was the first time I played it. Dude, that Vectrex is super fucking cool. Like generally speaking, I'll only buy old games if it's something that I owned at one point or I was interested in at one point. The Vectrex is like the only thing that'll make me break that rule. Like I never knew about this as a kid. I didn't know it existed. I've only found out about it like a couple of years ago, and man, it like I want it.
Yeah, I mean it's so cool. And just for I'm gonna be saying this a lot, but just for context for the people who are listening at home, if you've never seen a Vectrex, Google it. It's basically a small television that just plays video games. Like before the Sharp NES TV, before, sort of built-in video games into a television, the Vectrex is just a monitor with a cartridge slot and a controller that nests inside the TV. So once the controller's sort of in the TV, it's all one flush, sort of, it just looks like a television set until you pull a controller out of it. So it's really cool. And the way the controller is set up, it's a metal, I call it a joystick, but I think that would be a little generous.
Yeah, you'd hold it between, you'd either have your thumb resting on the top, or you'd hold the stick between your thumb and forefinger. It's that small.
Exactly. And then 4 buttons. The Vectrex is interesting because it did not get rid of overlays. It just changed where they go. So in the Vectrex, because it's vector graphics, everything's black and white. So every game came with an overlay for the screen, and that would just add color to the game. Usually, I believe they're mostly just one color, just overlays you slide over the screen, which was I think it's a cool option. Especially if you sort of get bored of watching your black and white vector graphics, you can add like a splash of blue or, a little bit of that. But with the controller specifically, I've only used it maybe a couple times. I remember it being solidly built, which is good because it, like I said, it nests in the actual console itself. So it's probably going to be exposed to, taking a little bit of abuse if you're moving it around or if you're actually using the console itself. So it seems like a solid built controller. The joystick, not great, but not terrible. And the buttons, from what I remember, felt pretty good. Like they were like not clicky arcade buttons, but better than what you would get in like a ColecoVision or a Atari 5200 for sure.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The buttons were definitely a step ahead of the old cell phone buttons on the Intellivision and the ColecoVision and the 5200. I thought the joystick was fine. I don't know. It like much like with the graphics, it looks like something from the future. And I think, I don't know, man, the Vectrex looks the most modern, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like, that's one thing. I'm speaking as a person who has never seen the Vectrex in real life. But and actually, like, right now I'm seeing the controller for the first time. And yeah, I think that's the very first, like, modern, like, when it comes to the form factory. I think, that must be the first one. And it looks actually really cool. I'm like, I would like to own one of those.
Absolutely. Yeah. Honestly, to me, like to my eye, when I saw the picture of it, because I hadn't seen it in a while, I knew I saw it in Brooklyn. But when I saw it, I was like, you take that metal joystick off and plop in like an arcade stick. And this is kind of like a Neo Geo-ish like type of setup. You know what I mean? Like 4 big round buttons. That are probably very satisfying to press, and a decent stick. So I don't know. The Vectrex might be a dark horse in this sort of competition for me. All right, and so now we're gonna get into. This was just we're sort of getting things out of the way, trying to be as thorough as we can. But now we're gonna get into some real shit. So 1985, the 8-bit era, I think, officially begins with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and what I have to assume is the birth of the modern video game controller with the NES controller. Would that be an exaggeration, do you think, Paul?
No, not at all. I mean, it's over 30 years later, and that is still the form factor we use. That's basically 100% correct.
Yeah. And I will say, I think, and I didn't include it because I didn't think about it until now, but I think that the American and European version of this controller is superior to the Japanese form factor for the Famicom. The Famicom controller is smaller, has rounded edges, and the buttons, as far as I can tell, are not concave like the NES buttons. They're rounded at the top. The original Famicom release actually had square buttons, from what I can tell. And what is probably the biggest drawback is that the Famicom controllers are connected to the console, so they're not the cords aren't very long on them.
And I mean, that's the deal with like all these Japanese controllers, because in Japan you often had like very small rooms in apartments.
Yep.
So that's why people were always like sitting like maybe like a meter away from the TV.
Yeah. Not so in American and I assume European homes. So we got sort of a more rectangular-ish controller, sharper corners, which is a problem for me at least. I find that when I play NES games for a long time, my hands, my fingers sometimes numb up, or if I'm holding it too tightly, it kind of digs into my hands like the corners do.
Absolutely, but that's part of the
but
charm.
That could just be, yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
you gotta play through the pain.
And I would say, like, as a kid, like when I was, 7, 8 years old, naturally, like my hands were a lot smaller, and I felt like the NES controller was perfect, for my hand size. But like nowadays, like honestly, like it's an iconic controller, but it doesn't really feel that comfortable.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the biggest knock against it is sort of form factor wise, and for extended play, it doesn't hold up as well for me as some other controllers. But, and this is what I'll say this knowing full well that I'm completely biased, but it seems to me like the NES controller is probably the perfect entry point to video games for a kid. I know kids nowadays are using all these crazy controllers and not having a problem, but when you get a D-pad, 2 buttons, and you're off, like I can't see a better way to start off learning how to play video games than that. It's simple, it's easy to pick up, and it sort of doesn't gate you by making you learn all these crazy sort of buttons on every side of this controller. When you're just starting off, I think the NES makes video games less intimidating for people who don't play video games.
Yep. No, that's a very good point.
Yeah, that's something, like I have a bunch of coworkers who aren't into video games, but a lot of them have actually, like, they're always like, well, the only game I've ever played was Super Mario on the 8-bit Nintendo, and for a lot of people, that was like literally like the only. I mean, that's the only video game that I've ever played. So yeah, and the NES controller overall, like, it looks really cool, like, and so iconic, and I feel like most people, even the people who haven't even played video games, like they would recognize that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Like even to your point with new people or kids, entering with video games. My wife's not a gamer by any stretch. Mm-hmm. She'll pick up a PlayStation controller, and it's like she's picking up dog poop. She's like very like carefully, and she's got this look on her face like, oh, what do I do with this? But the NES controller, like that's the one that she used when she was a kid, and it's very friendly, and it evokes good memories now. And the games, just by virtue of having fewer buttons, are simpler, and those are the ones that she likes. Something like like I tell her, hit the shoulder button, and she looks at me like, "What's wrong with you? I don't know what a shoulder button is."
And sometimes you might have like 2 sets of shoulder buttons, like the L and R, and then there's like the Z triggers, and like I mean. Like, as a long-time gamer, like, as someone who has played video games since I was a little kid, you don't really think about it, even with these modern controllers with, like, I don't know, with so many buttons. I mean, of course, sometimes, even for me, it might feel a bit overwhelming if I'm playing a brand new game, like, let's say, from a franchise that I'm not that familiar with, and then, it takes some time to learn the controls. But I can't even imagine how like intimidating and overwhelming it must be for people who have never like even held a controller, and then you get DualShock 4 or the Xbox One controller, start playing a game, and you're like, what am I doing? Like even like moving in a 3D space can be like very confusing.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many times like I've handed my girlfriend or a friend who doesn't play a lot of video games like a PlayStation 4 controller, a PS3 controller, Xbox 360 controller, and they're just like, what do I hit to do what? And then I have to like turn and basically sit down and start having like a 20-minute sort of masterclass on Controllers 101 to explain every single button and what it does. Whereas with the NES, it's just like A jumps, B shoots, D-pad moves.
And that's it. And you're set.
Yep. And, I think Nintendo recognized the success and the sort of genius of the NES controller. They only, as far as I can tell, first party wise, I think they only had two sort of big controller variants, the NES Max and the NES Advantage. The Max I've never used, but I think I would really enjoy it because it seems like it has a better form factor for bigger hands. And it also adds turbo buttons for the A and B buttons.
I'm going to disagree with you there, buddy.
Really?
Yeah, I have one, and I had access to one as a kid. I didn't own one as a kid, but I always wanted it because I had a friend who had one. And the turbo buttons are awesome. Like, there are so many games, like Track and Field 2, that the turbo buttons just destroy. But the D-pad is not friendly. And it actually...
looks more like a
you can't see how
joystick.
small it is in the pictures. That thing's fucking small.
Really?
Yeah, it's about the size of the regular NES controller.
Oh wow. Okay. So it's not that much better than the regular NES pad.
I would say it's worse.
Okay. Gotcha.
But yeah, I gotta say, like I mentioned earlier, like I was playing Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and there's this one part where you actually, to unlock a skill, you basically have to jump 6,000 times. And I don't have a Switch controller with a turbo button, and oh my god, I kept hitting like the jump button for like 90 minutes straight. And that's,
oh my lord,
quite possibly the most tedious thing I've ever done in any video game. And I was like, god damn it, I really wish I had a turbo button.
Yeah.
And then the NES Advantage, maybe Paul will not destroy my dreams about this one, because it also looks super cool. It's basically a joystick type controller for your NES games. Something that I've never used one in practice. I feel like it would have limited use, only because like I think the NES sort of thrived on platformers, and I can't see this being very useful for that. I could see it being more useful for like shooters or maybe beat 'em ups, or something like that. But it's basically a giant NES controller that sits on your lap with a full size joystick, a couple of turbo buttons, and I think it has a couple of dials on top that I think maybe control the speed of turbo.
I don't remember that.
Okay.
Which is to say that I don't remember. I'm not saying you're wrong or right.
Okay.
You're probably right. It probably does control the speed of the turbo. I won't destroy your dreams with this one. The NES Advantage was the shit back then.
Okay.
And today it's still fine. Like, again, it's smaller probably than you think it is.
Okay.
But it's a joystick, and it sits comfortably on your lap, and it has turbo, which for so many NES games was extremely important. Yeah, no, the NES Advantage is and was great.
One Zulu Niner pre-flight check.
Roger, Tower.
Turbo A.
That's a go.
Turbo B.
Check.
Cycloid control.
A-OK.
Rapid fire.
All right, let's fire it up.
The NES Max, only from Nintendo.
All right, and now we're moving on to something maybe a little less remembered, but I know somebody that does remember it fondly, and that's the Sega Master System controller. And so, Paul, why don't you tell me about the Sega Master System controller?
Yeah, that Sega Master System controller is unfortunate. Well, I mean, it's just an inferior NES controller. Like, unless I'm mistaken, earlier versions of it had the cable coming out the right side.
Oh, really?
Which, when you're holding, and let me just backpedal a little bit here. As a kid, I didn't give a shit about any of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're nitpicking now as adults, but as a kid, the Master System controller, the NES controller, it was all the same. But yeah, as an adult, there were many things wrong with this control pad. The lack of a select and start button, those two extra buttons were helpful. As a kid, I didn't care that the pause button and the reset button were on the system. We all sat so close to the TV back then.
Absolutely.
And, like, standing up and general movement are not as annoying as they are now as an old person.
Mm-hmm.
So getting up and hitting reset and pause was not a big deal. But yeah, nowadays, this controller it's just an inferior NES controller, unfortunately. The one thing it did have going for it, and like I mentioned earlier in the episode, is you can screw in that little joystick that it came with, which I did use. The problem with that joystick though is that, unless I'm mistaken, the screw threads, so you actually screw it in, right? Like, there's a little hole in the D-pad with threads in it, and the little joystick has threads on the bottom, and you screw them in. But I think, unless I'm mistaken, the threads were plastic, so all of my little D-pads broke.
Oh wow!
Yeah, to this day, I still have my old Sega Master System control pad with the crazy glue all over the D-pad. Yeah, from when I tried
stick
to
the joystick in there.
Yeah, exactly. And the crazy glue, like, it worked to an extent, but it would always just snap off after a few weeks. So I've got this old crazy glued controller still sitting in there.
Did the joystick, like, did screwing in the joystick appreciably, like, improve the control?
I don't remember.
Okay.
To my child brain, it did, because it was something. Oh wow, this is cool. It's like it's not flat anymore. Yay. But whether it actually improved control, probably not.
Okay.
I have a confession regarding this. I got a Master System 2 a few years ago from a friend of mine, and the box actually came with the joystick, but I didn't even know what it was. until this episode. I was like, what is this? Like, do you stick it in the console or something?
No.
Yeah, well, I mean, now you know what not to do with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Here's the one thing I'll say about the Sega Master System controller. I've used it a few times. I actually enjoy it. Strangely enough, even though it's, like you said, it's pretty much an NES controller, it feels a little bit more comfortable in my hands.
It does.
The one strike I do have against the Sega Master System controller, and I'll probably be saying this more than once, is the D-pad. The D-pad just feels a little squishier to me than the NES pad did.
Yeah.
And, and for those of you who can't see, the Sega Master System controller D-pad is just one solid piece. So it's a little easier, I think, to sort of slide around it and sort of move in directions you're not necessarily intending to move. But aside from that, I thought the buttons were good, and I thought the feel of it was actually a little bit better for me than the NES one, at least now as an adult.
Yeah, as an adult, if you use that D-pad, you'll find it to be a little bit inaccurate for the exact reason you said. Like, when you intimated that sliding around the D-pad and perhaps hitting inputs that you didn't want to hit is a possibility with it, it's 100% a possibility with it. And like, as a kid, again, I didn't care. I didn't know any better, right?
Yeah.
And it worked most of the time, and you get used to it. As an adult who's used to more modern controllers or like regular square D-pads, like, I tried playing, I don't remember what game it was, it's not important, but I tried, it was a platformer. It was Kung Fu Kid, I remember now. I was playing Kung Fu Kid, and I tried using the old Master System controller. I could not unplug it and plug the Genesis controller in fast enough. Just because, like, the D-pad was just... It just wasn't... It's not that it wasn't accurate, it's just that I was doing things accidentally because of its design.
Yeah. Alright. But moving on from the NES and Sega Master System, we have the third participant in, I think, the 8-bit era. I think the argument could be made 8-bit, 16-bit. I think it's considered 8-bit, if I'm not mistaken. But the TurboGrafx 16, released in 1989, I really like the TurboGrafx 16 gamepad. Again, like the NES, sort of rectangular shape, D-pad on one side, 2 buttons on the other, start and select button in the middle. But it added a built-in turbo for each button. So there's separate turbos, and there's 3 speeds to the turbo for each button. And I thought that was brilliant.
Great feature.
Yes. I thought that was great. If anything, the one drawback to this controller that I find, and it's not really fair because it's not the controller itself, it's the system. It's the fact that there's only one controller input by default, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. But aside from that, I really like the turbo pad, especially for, it feels like out of the three that we've talked about, the NES, the Master System, and this one, it feels like the one that was best designed for the kinds of games that you would play on that system. Shmups, sort of beat 'em up, anything that's like high sort of action, a lot of movement, a lot of button pressing, like those games work really well with this pad. At least that's what I found in playing with it.
Yeah, I use it to this day when I play my old Turbo and Turbo CD games. Love it. Yeah, I have no issues with it.
Have you ever used a TurboGrafx 16 controller, Masa?
Nope. Because once again, we never got Turbo in Europe.
Oh, that's right.
So yeah,
that's right. Turbo didn't release PAL.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, the controller, it looks nice. Like, I definitely would like to try it out someday.
Yeah. And actually, cooler than this, I think, the PC Engine controllers are like this, but a much cooler color scheme.
Yep.
Because this one's just sort of gray and black, but I think the PC Engine is like white and something, like white and black, maybe.
They had several different ones depending on depending on whether it was the PC Engine or the Duo or whatever. But yeah, it was like white and gray for the PC Engine. Really, really cool looking.
It's super cool. And then the Turbo Stick, which is I don't want to sound insulting, but I guess the NES advantage of TurboGrafx 16, like it's sort of a bigger form factor, bigger buttons, and a full joystick. I've never used a Turbo Stick. The one thing I can see just by looking at the picture, and I don't know if this sort of plays out the way I'm thinking it does, but I don't know how to describe it. The joystick doesn't seem like it has like full range of motion. It has like a cutout around it that shows you the directions that the joystick can go. So like down, up, left, right, and then diagonals. Does the joystick have to fall into that slot for it to go all the way down?
No, it just doesn't look good in pictures. It functions like a regular joystick.
Okay, awesome. And so I'm assuming you've used it before. Do you have a preference between that and the regular pad?
I've never actually used the Turbo Stick.
Okay.
But I'm pretty confident when I say that it doesn't work the way you think it does with those.
Okay.
I think
with the slots. Okay.
So gotcha. I couldn't tell you which one I prefer. I can tell you that I don't. The turbo pad is good enough that I don't really feel the need to use the stick. The stick would be a cool little thing to have, but like for me personally, it's pointless too. I think. Unless I get an adapter, I can't use it on a Turbo Duo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because they have different. I don't know. I can't remember anymore. Now that I think about it, whether the TurboGrafx and the Duo have different plugs. I think they do have different plugs, which is like ridiculous design flaw. The Duo just had like the regular PC Engine one. Anyway.
Yeah.
The bottom line is, if I wanted to use that stick, like that American Turbo Stick on my Duo, I don't think I would be able to anyway.
Okay. The thing with the Turbo Stick for me is, like, the NES advantage, I thought had at least having the turbo, because the original NES pad didn't have the turbo, was a good reason to have it. Yes. But because the turbo pad has turbo built into it, the stick just doesn't seem as useful as maybe the NES advantage is.
100% correct.
And I just realized that it's the turbo pad, so of course it needs to have turbo on it.
Well, it's got it in the name.
Yeah, exactly. So moving on to now the 16-bit era, I think we're really going to get rolling here. Obviously, Super Nintendo controller. My first controller. I love this controller. The thing about the Super Nintendo controller is it just feels right in my hands. It feels super comfortable. So I love it. I'm partial to the Famicom design with the different colored buttons, though. But aside from that, I think it's a great Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, my My issues with it are documented in that it's not a good Street Fighter 2 controller.
Yeah.
But other than that, like, you can't argue with it. Look at it. You know? It's so good.
And I would say it's quite a revolutionary controller. I mean, of course, the NES one was as well, but like basically the Super Nintendo one like gave birth to like all these. I mean, the fighting game genre in general. Like, yeah, sure, you had some 8-bit fighting games, but they were very, very limited when it comes to like special moves. But like with 6 buttons, it like really took fighting games to a whole nother level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. And I gotta say, the shoulder buttons, specifically, and I know for fighting games, terrible. But for some other games, the added functionality of the shoulder buttons was something I really enjoyed. But again, solid D-pad, solid build, good buttons. I don't think there's a lot we can say about this controller that hasn't been said. So with that, let's move on to the Genesis controller. The Genesis controller is interesting to me because I don't necessarily really like the original release of this controller. The 3-button controller, basically D-pad 3 buttons. I don't think it had any other buttons around the controller besides the 3 buttons. Is that right, Paul?
Correct.
Okay. So, looks cool. Very nice form factor. Very comfortable. Kind of big. Like, at least from what I remember, appreciably bigger than the Super Nintendo controller. But, not uncomfortably big. But the 6-button controller that was released afterwards is just so much better than the original 3-button for me, that I'm just super biased towards the 6-button controller.
I never actually had a 6-button Mega Drive or Genesis controller, but like I would have to say that back in the day, I definitely preferred the Super Nintendo one over like the 3-button Genesis controller. But I feel like nowadays, as my hands are bigger, and even like the Super Nintendo controller sometimes feels a bit small after getting used to the modern ones. I feel like I would probably like if I got to try out the 6-button one, I would probably like prefer that one over the 3-button one and the Super Nintendo one.
Yeah, I think you probably would too. The one thing about the 3-button controller that I'll say is that it just looks friggin' cool.
It looks awesome.
Yeah, there's just something about that design. Like, to me, it reminds me of Batman for some reason.
Yeah, the design and just like the matte black on it.
Yeah.
With like Sega Genesis logo in the middle looks freaking awesome.
Yeah, it's a really pretty controller. And back then, it was like, it just looked so slick and so like, I'm trying to find the word. I keep thinking cool, but cool doesn't quite evoke it. It just, it looks, it's the Batmobile of video game controllers, but like, the 1988 Batmobile, not the one from the 60s.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we want to talk, maybe not the Batmobile, but maybe the Cadillac of video game controllers from back in the day, we gotta talk Neo Geo AES and Neo Geo CD, right?
Oh man,
and here's the thing: I don't think this is gonna be a very long discussion. You want to play a Neo Geo? It's basically comes with a fully functioning arcade stick right out the box. That's what it is, right?
Yeah.
It's a full sized joystick and 4 buttons. I mean, it really did bring the arcade experience home. Like
could you imagine paying that much for a console and then getting like a little controller? No, if you're paying that kind of money, SNK is giving you a fucking joystick.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing with the Neo Geo, right? The games were huge, the controller's huge, like everything was just so big in your face. They're like, you're gonna pay for this, it's gonna be quality. I've used it a couple times. I think the body is metal, like it's cut metal. So it's a pretty solid controller. I do know that the tops of the joysticks switch out, so you can get 2 different tops. There's a concave one and just a regular ball one. And then there's the optional controller, which was the kidney controller. Just a smaller sort of version of the original AES controller. But again, I like that the Neo Geo sort of simplified controllers again. Joystick, 4 buttons, here we go.
Not only that, you'll notice that the way the 4 buttons are laid out, it's the first time, at least I remember seeing it. Because when you're holding a joystick, right, like when you have 4 buttons lined up perfectly horizontally, you kind of have to like twist your wrist a little bit to have all your fingers over them. This is the first one I saw that had a very comfortable placement of the buttons that's more natural to the way your hand
the way your hand falls
it.
on the buttons is just like the way your fingers are lined up.
Yeah, and like when you see controllers, like anytime. So for example, unless I'm mistaken, I think the Dreamcast joystick. We've got a picture of the Dreamcast joystick here. I should just pull it up, but
yep.
I think the Dreamcast joystick didn't have that kind of. No, it did. Yeah, never mind. It had like the little kind of sloping of the buttons, but as far as I know, the Neo Geo is the first one that actually had that kind of sloping button layout, and it's just way more comfortable.
Yeah, it's awesome. And then the CD I've never used, but it came with a gamepad. Doesn't look like anything super special. The joystick looks like one of these clicky joysticks that I'm not a huge fan of. But having not used it, I can't say for sure.
Yeah, like a lot of these consoles, like that we have talked about like so far, I haven't gotten to even try them out because they were never released in Finland. But like I gotta say, like I'm super lucky. Like I never had a Neo Geo myself, but like one of my friends actually, like his brothers had one, and
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it was like such a mind blowing experience. Especially like I had used the NES Advance or Advantage, and and yeah, like and then holding like that Neo Geo arcade stick, that was like that was really fucking mind blowing.
This thing is heavy, man. That thing
is
solid.
Like all these other like the earlier ones, like like the NES one, it's decent, but it feels so cheap compared to the Neo Geo one.
Yeah,
like, that thing is fucking legit.
And so, Paul, what were you going to say about the gamepad?
Yeah, one thing about that Neo CD pad, I haven't used the Neo CD pad, but that little clicky thumbstick, it looks a lot like the thumbstick on the Neo Geo Pocket. And I gotta say, the thumbstick on the Neo Geo Pocket was shockingly good.
Really?
It looked a lot different at the time, so I was kind of dubious when I got it a long time ago. But man, that little D-pad I thought it was great.
And that wraps up part 1 of our video game controller retrospective. We really hope you guys enjoyed listening. Please leave us a review on iTunes. Really appreciate it. And get in touch with us. You can find us on @RegionFreeGamers on Instagram. Thanks for listening. Take care.